Lecture 2, The Epic of Gilgamesh.
Hello, and welcome back to Lecture 2, in which we're going to talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the earliest surviving work of literature in the Western literary canon, and yet this work had disappeared, had become entirely unknown by no later than the 2nd century BC, until a version of it was discovered by archaeologists excavating the ruins of the Royal Library of Nineveh in the 19th century. This rediscovery of the Epic of Gilgamesh in the Library of Nineveh is one of the most exhilarating archaeological accomplishments of the 19th century. It was part of the uncovering of ancient Mesopotamian culture in general, and among the other things that archaeologists discovered were fragments of tablets containing versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh. In 1850 and 1853, archaeologists excavating in Nineveh found the royal library, which contained collections of Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king of the area, who had ruled from 668 to 627 BC. Ashurbanipal had compiled a library in which he collected a great number of texts on cuneiform tablets, clay tablets, written in the Akkadian language. And among these tablets in the ruins of the library were 12 containing what scholars now call the standard version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. I'll come back to the different versions of this epic a bit later in the lecture. The archaeologists who discovered these tablets weren't able to read them. They had no idea what it was that they had found, but they sent these tablets and many others back to the British Museum in London because these were British archaeologists. The first publication and translation of any part of the Gilgamesh epic was done by the British Assyriologist George Smith in 1872. In that year, in 1872, Smith presented a paper, a scholarly paper, to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London, and his paper was on what he called a Chaldean account of the biblical flood. Chaldean is another term for Mesopotamian. This was Tablet 11 of the Gilgamesh tablets, which does indeed include an account of a great flood, and we'll come back to that and its parallels with the account in Genesis near the end of this lecture. Now, understandably, Smith's publication of this fact caused great excitement since it seemed to provide independent verification of the biblical account of Noah. If you can imagine being George Smith, reading for the first time in all those centuries another account of the flood story that no one had expected, no one knew it was there, that has got to be one of the most exciting moments in the history of scholarship when he realized what it was he had in front of him. But neither Smith nor anyone else realized at that point that these fragmentary tablets also contained the oldest work of literature in the Western tradition, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Since Smith's publication of the flood story in 1872, our knowledge of the Epic of Gilgamesh has increased enormously. For one thing, archaeologists have continued to excavate in Mesopotamia, and they've discovered more tablets which fill in some of the gaps in the fragmentary version discovered in the 1850s, although, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, the process of filling in gaps from other tablets is in itself problematic. Archaeological excavations and decipherment of other Babylonian texts have increased our knowledge about Mesopotamian culture in general, and of course that's always helpful for understanding how the epic works. For instance, we know that the historical king Gilgamesh, on whom the epic is based, lived around 2800 BC and was deified, was treated as a god by about 2600. However, while these continuing discoveries have increased our knowledge of Mesopotamian culture and of the context of the Gilgamesh epic, they've also, as I touched on at the end of Lecture 1, made the problematic nature of the Gilgamesh text increasingly clear. As the scholar Stephanie Daly, who's done translation of the Gilgamesh epic, puts it, quote, "The more text fragments come to light, the harder it becomes to produce one coherent edition." So the more we find out about this text, the harder it becomes to say what we mean exactly by this text at all. There are two main sources of difficulty for establishing a definitive text. Those are linguistic and chronological. Mesopotamian literature was written in two different and unrelated languages, Sumerian and Akkadian. Fragments of Gilgamesh poems, both of the epic and of other poems about Gilgamesh, exist in both of these languages, in both Sumerian and Akkadian. The situation is complicated, but very briefly, Sumerian had died out as a spoken language by about 2000. Remember, the historical king Gilgamesh ruled around 2800. So by about 2000 BC, Sumerian had died out as a spoken language, but it continued to be used as a priestly and literary language. Think of the way Latin was used as a language of scholarship in Europe long after the spoken languages were French, Italian, Spanish, and so forth. In fact, scribes, Mesopotamian scribes, had to learn Sumerian before they were trained to write their native Akkadian. If we use the later European comparandum, that's not as strange as it sounds. A little boy going to school in Germany, in the Middle Ages, for instance, probably would have learned to read and write Latin before he learned to read and write his own native German. So scribes had to learn Sumerian before they were trained in writing their native Akkadian. Akkadian was the common spoken language from about 2000 on, when Sumerian died out as a spoken language, but there was undoubtedly a period of overlap when Akkadian was becoming ascendant and when spoken Sumerian, was dying out. Akkadian became a language of literary production from around 1750 BC on. So there's a stretch of centuries when probably there were oral traditions about Gilgamesh circulating in both Sumerian and Akkadian, and we have some written versions of Gilgamesh stories, the epic and other poems, in both of these languages. Now, our primary versions of the text of the Epic of Gilgamesh itself are all in Akkadian. But there are other extant Sumerian poems about Gilgamesh that overlap with some episodes in the epic. As I said, it's an extremely complicated situation, and you can see why Stephanie Dalley says the more we find, the harder it becomes to come up with a text. Even when we look just at the Akkadian versions of the epic, the picture is still extraordinarily complicated. There are fragments of three different main versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which span a period of over 1,000 years. The so-called Old Babylonian versions were written around 1700 BC. The standard version, which is the one discovered on the 12 tablets in Nineveh, dates from the 7th century. So there you have a 1,000-year gap. Now, those 12 tablets that were discovered in the Library of Nineveh contain the Epic of Gilgamesh standard version, so-called, on the first 11 tablets. The 12th tablet turns out to be an Akkadian translation of an unrelated Sumerian poem about Gilgamesh, not part of the epic itself. In between the Old Babylonian and the standard version were the middle versions. Sometimes scholarly terms make sense. The middle versions are in between the Old and the Standard. They were written between 1500 and 1300. Copies of these have been found as far afield as Anatolia, Palestine, and Syria, along with translations into the native languages of those places, just to make the situation even more complex. So, studying the Epic of Gilgamesh is thus a very different thing from studying most literature, even most ancient literature, since there is not a text of the epic. And I talked about that in the first lecture, how difficult it is even to say what we mean by the epic. And the term standard version is something of a misnomer, but it is the term that scholars tend to use for the text that was found on the 7th century tablets in the ruins of the library at Nineveh. Now, the textual history of the Epic of Gilgamesh could take a whole course on its own to unravel, but the good news is that enough of the overall plot and themes are discernible to make it clear that this work does indeed deserve to be called both an epic and to be called Western culture's earliest work of literature, even in its fragmentary state. The story focuses on one main character of exceptional status and divine parentage. Gilgamesh is king of a great city, Uruk, modern-day Warka. He's the son of a goddess, although he's part human himself. Those of you who are familiar with the Iliad and the Odyssey will recognize the theme of a hero with divine parentage and a hero who is powerful and preeminent either through kingship or warriorship or some other aspect. The narrative of the Epic of Gilgamesh focuses in large part on his relationship to his counterpart and friend Enkidu, who is created both as a rival and as a companion to Gilgamesh. Enkidu seems pretty clearly to represent natural man, or man before the advent of civilization, while Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, seems to be ultra-civilized, civilized man to perhaps too much of an extent. The first encounter of these two characters is a fight, but after they fought with one another, they become fast friends. The plot of the epic also deals with two primary themes, the quest for fame and the quest for immortality, and the relationship between those two things. These are the same overriding concerns that inform the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, as we'll talk about in Lectures 7 and 8. The desire for fame, for your name to live on after you, and the desire for direct immortality. Like Achilles and Odysseus after him, Gilgamesh has to confront the implications of death, Enkidu's death and his own death, and the question of whether fame, whether knowing that his name will live on after him, provides a sufficient compensation for death. The fragmentary state of the Epic of Gilgamesh means that we can't be quite sure how Gilgamesh answers this question, how he comes to terms with the reality of mortality, the reality of death. But most readers seem to think that at the end of the epic, Gilgamesh does find sufficient immortality, or another way of putting it, sufficient compensation for his own inevitable death in surveying the fame of his city Uruk. The end of the epic as we have it, he's looking at the walls of Uruk and talking about how glorious they are. And most readers take that as an indication that he has come to terms with his own mortality through knowledge that his city and his name will live on after him. Now, another element that the Epic of Gilgamesh has in common with the Homeric epics and with later Greek and Roman literature as well is its assumption of a polytheistic worldview. In other words, this is a world in which there is not one god, but many gods. We'll be talking about, or at least touching on, the nature of the gods of Greek and Roman literature at several points in later lectures in parts 1 and 2 of the course. At this point, I want to sketch out very briefly some of the implications, both for the Epic of Gilgamesh and bear them in mind for later Greek and Roman literature, some of the implications of ancient polytheism. I could call it ancient Mediterranean polytheism. Polytheism as it functions both in Mesopotamian culture and later in classical Greek and Roman culture. In both Mesopotamian and the Greco-Roman religious systems, the gods were not creators outside the universe. That's the idea that my students in mythology classes always find it hardest to come to terms with. Gods who aren't creators, gods who are not transcendent, are not outside the natural world, but are part and parcel of the natural world. First and foremost, these gods, these ancient Mediterranean gods, Mesopotamian and Greek both, seem to be natural forces or elements of the universe, the sky, the earth, the sea, that sort of thing. So they are as much part of the natural world as we are. In fact, Mesopotamian gods, unlike Greek gods, are not even immortal, surprisingly enough. As we'll see in the next lecture, in lecture number 3, a Mesopotamian god can be killed. We'll talk about the death of the goddess Tiamat in comparison to the Genesis narrative in the next lecture. Greek gods were immortal, of course. That's one of the primary distinctions between gods and humans in Greek and Roman culture. But even the immortal Greek gods were not transcendent, by which I mean, again, they weren't outside the universe, they were part of the universe. In a polytheistic system, such as this one, gods are gendered. They come in male and female, and they reproduce sexually. And this implies their ability to produce offspring with human beings. Anyone who's read any Greek mythology will know that the gods very often produce offspring with human beings. And I mentioned already that Gilgamesh himself has a goddess for his mother. In fact, we're told that Gilgamesh is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. I know, it doesn't work. He has to be either 1/2 or 1/4, but that's not what it says. It says he's 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. His mother is a goddess. And not only is Gilgamesh himself part divine, but again, like the heroes of Greek mythology, he is courted by a goddess. The goddess Ishtar, the Mesopotamian equivalent of Aphrodite, the goddess of sexual passion, wants to marry Gilgamesh and is furious when he rebuffs her. But despite their sexual unions with human beings, as natural forces or elements of the universe, the Mesopotamian gods and the Greek gods are not particularly fond of human beings, particularly disposed to be merciful towards them, to be just or compassionate or benevolent in any way at all. Sometimes they are, but you certainly can't count on it. Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh, does not include a creation story for humans in general, as opposed to Enkidu in particular. We're told about his creation, but humans are just there in the Epic of Gilgamesh. There is, however, another surviving Mesopotamian poem, the Atrahasis, which does recount the creation of human beings. And we're told in that poem that the gods made humans so that they themselves, the gods, could gain relief from work. The minor gods were doing all the work, and they were tired, they didn't want to do the work anymore, and so they created human beings specifically as laborers. In other words, humans were to the gods somewhat in the same relation that slaves are to free people in this culture. So humans were made to be the gods' servants or slaves. Humans were created because they were useful. Greek myth doesn't say that humans were created for the purpose of serving the gods, but it certainly implies very strongly that humans must strive to please the gods, must not anger them, and that the gods are, well, capricious and not, again, necessarily compassionate, merciful, or just. So this is a worldview which we need to bear in mind, both in talking about the Epic of Gilgamesh and later when we come to Greek and Roman culture, a worldview in which the justice, mercy, general overall well-disposedness towards human beings of the gods can by no means be assumed or taken for granted. Sometimes the gods want to treat us well, at other times they don't. And these implications of ancient Mediterranean polytheism are, as I said, worth bearing in mind as we move on throughout the first two parts of this course. Now, the plot of the Epic of Gilgamesh, as it survives, can be summarized fairly quickly, bearing in mind all the implications of the fragmentary nature of the text. There are gaps, there are some episodes that are hard to follow, but the overall narrative outline seems relatively clear in all the versions. The first main section, and here I'll be referring to the tablets of the standard version, the first main section on tablets 1 and 2 concerns the creation of Enkidu and his taming through an encounter with a prostitute, or a harlot, as she's usually translated. Gilgamesh, as the epic opens, the king of Uruk, is overly proud and arrogant and is oppressing his people. His people pray for relief, and this is a time when the gods do decide to be helpful to humans. The gods decide to create Enkidu as a kind of counterpart to Gilgamesh, someone who will be Gilgamesh's equal and Gilgamesh's rival, and through his encounter with Gilgamesh will, in effect, get Gilgamesh to behave in a more reasonable way than he has been doing. Enkidu is created as a wild man in a natural and uncivilized state. He lives with animals, he eats grass, he's covered with hair, he knows nothing of civilization. And fascinatingly, he is tamed or civilized through an encounter with a prostitute who introduces him to sexuality. She finds Enkidu, has sex with him for several days and nights on end, and this somehow brings Enkidu into civilization. Freudians could have a field day with this, and I'm sure they have. Enkidu also is brought into civilization through learning to eat bread and drink ale. I'll quote just very briefly from the epic itself. The prostitute brings Enkidu into to meet other people, and we're told, bread they set before him, ale they set before him. How to eat bread Enkidu knew not, how to drink ale he had never been shown. The harlot opened her mouth, saying, eat the bread, Enkidu, essential to life, drink the ale, the lot of the land. Enkidu ate the bread until he was sated. He drank the ale a full 7 goblets. His mood grew free. He started to sing. His heart grew merry. His face lit up. The barber groomed his body so hairy. Anointed with oil, he turned into a man. He put on a garment, became like a warrior. He took up his weapon to do battle with lions. A very, very interesting nexus there of eating bread, drinking ale, and thereby becoming civilized. There's no direct connection that I know of between drinking seven goblets of ale and having a haircut and anointing your body and putting on clothes for the first time, but that's how it's presented. Through sexuality and through learning to eat human food and drink human drink, Enkidu becomes civilized. When he and Gilgamesh meet, they fight, but after the fight, they become fast friends. And the next main section of the epic, tablets 3 through 7, narrates Gilgamesh's and Enkidu's quest for fame and their deeds of prowess. In tablets 3 through 5, the two friends undertake a dangerous journey to a great cedar forest where they kill the forest's guardian, a monster named Humbaba. Now, unfortunately, the portion of the narrative that relates the actual killing of Humbaba is badly damaged, but enough is left for us to realize that they do kill him. In tablet 6, back in Uruk, the goddess Ishtar is smitten with desire for Gilgamesh, asks him to become her husband. He rebuffs her. He points out that her previous consorts, none of them came to a good end, and that he wants nothing to do with her. And in rage, she sends the bull of heaven against him, but Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill the bull of heaven as well. So this segment of the narrative shows them fighting monsters, having encounters with this goddess, acting out deeds of heroic prowess. The third main section of the text, tablets 7 and 8, deals with Enkidu's sickness and death and Gilgamesh's mourning for his lost friend. Tablet 7 opens with Enkidu narrating a dream that he's had about his own death. He has dreamed that the gods are angry over the slaying of Humbaba and the despoiling of the cedar forest, and the gods have decreed that one of the two, Gilgamesh or Enkidu, must die. Enkidu falls ill. He laments his fate. He laments that he was ever civilized. He says it would have been better for him to stay out running with the animals and eating grass. And he laments the shame of dying from illness rather than dying in battle. Again, unfortunately, the actual description of Enkidu's death is missing from the end of Tablet 7, but Tablet 8 describes Gilgamesh's mourning for Enkidu. And then finally, the last section of the epic in the standard version, Tablets 9 through 11, narrates Gilgamesh's travels in search of the secret of immortality. Gilgamesh starts by mourning for Enkidu's death, then he starts thinking about his own death. He starts realizing that he as well will die, and he goes in quest of immortality. He wants to discover the secret of eternal life. He does not want to die as Enkidu has died. Gilgamesh sets out to find the one and only man who has ever become immortal and learn from him the secret of avoiding death. And this is a man named Utnapishti. Gilgamesh's travels in search of Utnapishti take him to the edge of the world, to the far western edge of the world, where he will then have to cross the waters of death, also known, I suppose, as the Atlantic Ocean, if we want to try to map this onto actual Mediterranean geography. At the edge of the world, he meets a goddess, Shiduri, who keeps a tavern. Shiduri tells Gilgamesh that his journey is pointless. She says, you will not gain immortality. But she says if he insists on continuing, he'll have to be ferried across the waters of death to where Utnapishti lives on the far side. And Shiduri tells Gilgamesh where to find the ferryman Urshanabi, who can take him over to Utnapishti's land. Gilgamesh finally comes to the land of Utnapishti, and Utnapishti, like Shiduri before him, tells Gilgamesh, your quest is pointless. Death is inevitable. Yes, Utnapishti and his wife are immortal, but they are immortal because they survived the Great Flood. They were the only human beings who survived the Great Flood as survivors of a flood that had been sent to wipe out humanity. The gods granted Utnapishti and his wife immortality, but that was a one-time only thing. It's not ever going to happen again. It won't be given to any other human being. At his wife's urging, however, Utnapishti gives Gilgamesh a gift for his return journey. He says, I can't make you immortal, I can't tell you how to do that, but I can tell you how to find a plant at the bottom of the sea that will rejuvenate you, that will give you back your youth, which I guess is a pretty good consolation prize for not getting immortality. If you could find this plant and then every time you grew old, eat it and become young again, you could at least get yourself an extremely long span of life, even if not true immortality. And interestingly, the name Gilgamesh may well mean the old man has become young again. That may be what the name means. Gilgamesh dives to the bottom of the sea, which is where the plant that Utnapishtim has described is. He finds the plant, he picks it, and he sets out for home. However, when Gilgamesh stops for the night to bathe in a pool, he puts the plant down beside the pool, and a snake comes slithering up, steals the plant. So Gilgamesh returns home with neither immortality nor ever-renewable youth. This is obviously, among other things, an etiological myth, an explanatory myth for why it is that snakes can shed their skin and apparently become young again. The snake got the plant of rejuvenation. Tablet 11 ends with Gilgamesh talking to Ur-Shanabi. He was the ferryman who took Gilgamesh across the waters of death, remember. Gilgamesh is praising the walls of Uruk to Ur-Shanabi, saying, look at how strong the walls of Uruk are. So his quest for immortality comes to nothing, but he does end up, at least, back at his own city, praising its walls. Now, Gilgamesh's conversation with Utnapishtim in Tablet 11 includes the narrative of the Great Flood that so astonished George Smith and the Society of Biblical Archaeology in 1872. And the parallels with the Genesis account of Noah's flood are indeed striking. In both stories, there's a divine decision to send a great flood to wipe out humanity. In both stories, a god warns one man to build a boat and to save not only himself but also animals. There's a detailed description of the building of the boat, and after the flood, the survivor sends out a bird to see if there's anywhere to land, to see if dry land has appeared again. So there are clearly some strong narrative parallels, but there are also some very striking differences. Utnapishtim takes other people with him, including all his relatives, as well as craftsmen and artisans, where Noah takes just his wife and sons and their wives. The flood lasts only 7 days, rather than the 40 days and 40 nights of Genesis. And most importantly, Utnapishtim and his wife are given immortality, since they survived, which certainly does not happen for Noah and his wife or his children. Another important difference is recounted not in the Gilgamesh tablets, but in the Atrahasis, that other Mesopotamian poem I mentioned that talks about the creation of humanity. In Genesis, God decides to wipe humanity out because of their sinfulness. But in the Atrahasis, the gods are annoyed by human overpopulation. Human beings are making too much noise and the gods can't sleep. And that's why they decide to wipe human beings out. So again, the difference, the motivation is very, very important. Now, when these sorts of parallels between the Gilgamesh flood narrative and the Genesis story were first identified in the 19th century, one reason they were so electrifying to scholars, one reason they were so important, was because they raised the question of priority. By that I mean they raised the question of which text is influencing which text. Was the Genesis narrative written first, and did the Gilgamesh narrative draw upon it, or the other way around? The Genesis narrative was written no earlier than the 10th or 9th century BC, as we'll talk about in the next lecture. The Mesopotamian material is much older, but this doesn't necessarily settle the question of priority. The written texts of both cultures reflect oral traditions that are much, much older, and so just because the written Mesopotamian version that we have predates the written Hebrew version doesn't necessarily mean that the Mesopotamians were the first to tell the story. Perhaps the only thing we can say with certainty is that flood stories and other elements of Mesopotamian and Hebrew literature were current in the ancient Near East, were traded back and forth between cultures. Different cultures wrote them down in somewhat different versions. Trying to establish direction of influence or priority is probably impossible. Well, fragmentary though it is, and difficult though it may be to piece together one firm version, the Epic of Gilgamesh, nevertheless, has a power to move and astonish readers even today. Clearly, it is filled with extremely rich possibilities, thematic possibilities for exploration and consideration. One of the most obvious and fascinating to me themes is the connection of sexuality and civilization, or sexuality and self-awareness as a human being. That Enkidu only recognizes that he is human, only becomes human, really, when he comes into sexual self-awareness. Then there's the whole treatment of male friendship. Enkidu and Gilgamesh fight. They try to kill each other, and then they become best and closest friends. Now, one could spend a lot of time talking about male psychology, male bonding, and why it is that trying to kill one another links them together as the closest of friends. Their companionship is expressed thereafter in shared dangers. One could also explore the parallels between Gilgamesh's wanderings in search of immortality and Odysseus's wanderings in which he rejects immortality. I'll come back to that very briefly in the lecture on the Odyssey. The more one looks at this epic, the richer it becomes. And I think that makes it a very fitting beginning to a course such as this one. As far back as we can look, we find that human beings are fundamentally storytelling creatures. Aristotle said that man is an animal that lives in a polis, not a political animal, but a man that lives in a polis, a man that lives in an animal that lives in a city. One can also say that human beings are storytelling animals, are animals that tell stories. One reason we tell stories is both to ask and to explore questions of what it means to be human. And here, as far back as we can look in extant literature, all the way back in the Epic of Gilgamesh, we find the same questions. What separates humans from animals? What is friendship? Why do humans die? Could we avoid death? Where do we find comfort for death, our own and others? Like all the world's greatest literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh doesn't give us any pat, easy answers to these questions. Instead, it helps us see what the questions are. So in this lecture, we've laid the beginnings of the course through looking at the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the next lecture, we'll turn to the Hebrew Bible, talk about Genesis and the documentary hypothesis.